From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm John Cole. I'm the director of the Center for the Book in the Library of Congress, and I'm glad to welcome you to a Writers Project afternoon. We not only will talk about and celebrate and have a chance to buy and sign a fine new book, but we also are going to see excerpts from a fine new film, also called Soul of a People, sorry, I better get that straight. The Center for the Book is co-sponsoring this program with the American Folklife Center. Both of our internal organizations have been interested in the whole WPA arts projects for a number of years. The Library of Congress, as you know, is a major repository, not the only repository, but a major repository of all of the Federal One projects, those that were created by the New Deal, which included all of the arts projects, including not just the Writers Project, but also the Theater Project, Historical Records Survey, the Federal Art Project, and of course I'm missing one that someone else can supply for me. Music Project, thank you. And one of the reasons that we are so rich in this is due to a Librarian of Congress who was a New Dealer, Archibald MacLeish, who of course was named by President Roosevelt to be Librarian of Congress. I shouldn't say of course, he was named. In 1939, just about the time that the New Deal projects were falling, the New Deal arts projects were coming apart, starting with the Federal Theater Project. For the Library of Congress, this was significant because MacLeish realized the value of these projects that around the country that no longer would have a home, and he pretty much volunteered for the Library of Congress to become the place where a number of the so-called valuable research remnants of the New Deal projects would come to the Library of Congress. And for a brief year and a half, there was something called the Library of Congress Project, which had the job of taking in and processing a lot of the material that was coming in from the States. Initially, and I think our author David and others will be able to comment on this, there were also certain editorial responsibilities given to the Library of Congress project, but they only lasted about a year and a half, and then the emphasis was on getting this stuff, this American stuff, into our collections. And that, of course, is going to be one of the focal points that we'll talk about today. The Center for the Book had a program in 1994 where we invited back everyone that was still around who'd worked on any of the WPA arts projects, and a number of you I know were here. We did oral history interviews. We transcribed that program, but that was the time when the Library of Congress was just starting to digitize a lot of its materials, and we will talk more today, I think, in the questions and answers about the American Memory Project and a number of the online resources for the Library of Congress WPA projects. And on that point, after the Center for the Book hosted this program, which was in 1994, our partners today, the American Folklife Center, increasingly became interested in the projects, and they hosted a major Library of Congress event called the New Deal at 75, which was held in March here, and it had kind of the same idea, and that was we talked about the Library of Congress under the leadership of the Folklife Center and the New Deal materials. And the emphasis on the scholarly side was younger scholars who were still interested and are finding new topics in this major treasure trove at the Library of Congress and at the National Archives and at some other institutions. But our curators also had a chance to talk about new developments in the collections and how we're helping make them accessible. And one of our speakers today on the panel is Peggy Bulger, who is the head of the American Folklife Center, and I want her to say a few words about the Folklife Center's write-up of that wonderful New Deal project and a little bit about the website that's been developed as sort of an access point to the Library of Congress and these resources. We are going to begin, however, with a look at the film, and let me introduce my colleagues for the afternoon. Andrea is here, Andrea Kalin, who is the director and the co-producer of the film. She's going to introduce the excerpts we're going to hear and see, of course. Peggy Bolger was here a few minutes ago, and I know there you are, Peggy. And Peggy, I see that our colleagues from the American Folklife Center did provide, there's Steve, copies of this for you, which are now at the back of the room. We also have David Royal, who is the Smithsonian Channel Vice President for Programming, and the film itself is going to appear first on the Smithsonian Channel, and David, in his remarks at the beginning of the panel, will say something about the Smithsonian and its channel and this whole notion of sharing the wealth, which there are many, many educational projects, and maybe Andrea can mention a couple of others that are spreading the word about not only this particular film and book, but the particular emphasis that both of them take. And David Taylor is here, who is going to conclude, have charge of the second part of our program, where he will talk about the book itself, and we will conclude with a book sales and book signing and a reception. So I am very pleased you're here, and I'm going to turn the program over to Andrea Kalin, who is the director and co-producer with David of the film, and she's going to tell us a little bit about what we're about to see. And never forget, as I'm the director of the Center for the Book, that all of this has resulted in yet one more wonderful book about the New Deal. So we not only are delving into it, but we're also producing our own versions of how the New Deal materials can be used and can live forever. Andrea?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm a local filmmaker in Washington, D.C., and I wanted to first thank John and Peggy and everyone at the Center for American Folklife and all the various librarians that we have pestered and badgered over making this film. The library was a keen supporter of the project even before when people would say to me, oh, this is really timely. They were in it with us right from the beginning, and in fact, when we were in boom times. And though I wouldn't wish an economic downturn, and I can't take the blame for it, it is helping the interest in our film. And timing is everything. I mean, tomorrow, in fact, is Obama's first 100 days. And with that, everyone's looking at the hundreds of billions of dollars that are going to a stimulus package. And while reviewing and analyzing and evaluating what is the stimulus package going to do, people are again reemerging their thinking and their attention to the WPA and the New Deal projects. But I think it's really important that we point out that the New Deal wasn't just, or the WPA, about construction. It was also about the arts, because the country at the time wasn't just hurting economically, it was hurting emotionally. Devastated and ragged from the Depression, the arts projects also gave the country a sustenance and perhaps a way to rediscover some of the stories that were yet to be told, and to get a better sense of who we are as a people, what our values are about, what ties us together. And as a filmmaker, what's exciting for me is also the sense of discovery, being able to dig into these stories and to be able to have the opportunity to bring them back to life. And it's also that I'm able, with David, to be taking from all of the arts programs, that is the photographs, the music, the artwork, even the theater project, and bring it all together as it was once envisioned. In 4 short years, the Writers Project came out with a guidebook to every state, hundreds of pamphlets, thousands of oral histories, and our opportunity now is to try to bring all these arts projects in one fabric together so that it can relive what its original vision was and what people had thought the country needed so much at that time, and we feel needed this time as well. So this is a very short excerpt. It's actually highlights from the film, so it's not necessarily linear, and it starts with an introduction to the Smithsonian Channel, which, as John just described, is the broadcaster and will be premiering the show this fall. Thank you.
Somebody once said that the great oxygen of the United States is optimism. Well, if that's the case, what happens when the oxygen gets depleted? When you can't really breathe anymore and you're just worried about where your next meal's going to come from.
I have one recollection of walking home from high school on 55th Street, and there was a run on a bank, and there were crowds of people trying to get into the bank to draw their money out. And I thought to myself, don't ever forget this.
And that's what the Depression did. It forced people to see that no matter how good one's life is, in a matter of a minute, it could be gone.
Roosevelt was coming into a maelstrom of problems, and he had to do something bold.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
In the 1930s, the United States sat down with pen in hand and began to write, giving voice to its hopes and fears. Its subject was what made America, America. Its authors were a pauper's army of men and women. Facing the Great Depression, President Franklin Roosevelt launched the New Deal. Generations would see its legacy in roads and bridges. But less obvious was another program, one that would become the largest cultural experiment in the nation's history. The Federal Riders Project. The goal of the project was emergency relief. No one expected the program to create anything meaningful or controversial. But this was a pivotal moment when old ways were breaking down and new American stories were emerging.
In a sense, the WPA forces us not to divide people, books, good literature from one another. It makes America recognize where those values come from and how they get reaffirmed through literature.
At its height, the project employed almost 7,000 people from Alaska to Puerto Rico. Their experiences would brand them as writers and help shape modern American literature. Many would leave an enduring record of the uncommon stories of common folk. Some would go on to chronicle the magic of everyday life in lyrical fiction. Still others would help move African American life from the margins to the heart of American culture. And thousands more unsung today would be changed forever. Their discoveries would ripple through America for decades.
This is revolutionary. When you look at it in historical, cultural terms, it shook things up, and things needed shaking up.
By 1932, nearly 1/3 of America was out of work. In the nation's biggest cities, unemployment climbed to 50%. Banks failed. Life savings disappeared without a trace.
But what happened was Wall Street was unregulated. You had the stock market crash. People were feeling very ripped off and bitter.
One observer to these events was a young Chicago law student, Louis Turkle, whom friends called Studs.
The Depression was on, and private enterprise, as we call free market today, fell on its fanny.
Though not everyone was jobless, the disaster touched every family.
The Depression was a shock. It was the proof that what we had been doing as a nation just did not work.
After years of overplanting and drought, farms in the Great Plains finally withered. America's breadbasket became the Dust Bowl, and the downward spiral worsened.
This was a situation in which you had to have help, and it changed the way people saw the government. It changed what people expected from the government.
When Roosevelt was elected, a friend predicted that history would judge him the greatest president if he got the country back on its feet, or the worst one if he failed.
I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States, so help me God.
If I fail, Roosevelt replied, I shall be the last one. In his first year, he signed a flurry of new laws, including the National Recovery Act, bank reform measures, and farm relief.
I'm a law-abiding citizen, my debts I sure will pay. I'm a law-abiding citizen, baby, and my debts I sure will pay.
FDR launched more drastic measures to create jobs.
My most immediate concern is in carrying out the purposes of the great work program just enacted by the Congress. Its first objective is to put men and women now on the relief rolls to work.
Roosevelt had to inject some optimism into the American spirit. Let's not blame people. Let's not even blame institutions. Let's pull together and find new, innovative ways to fix the American government.
Roosevelt created the Works Progress Administration.
New York City, federal jobs at the rate of 100 a minute.
In time, nearly 8 million people found jobs with the WPA, most wielding picks and shovels to build bridges, libraries, and public parks.
I've been out of work for 3 years. I have a wife and 3 children, and I'm tickled to death to have a job.
Despite a reluctance to accept welfare, millions went to work in an alphabet soup of new agencies. Besides the WPA, there was the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, FERA, Federal Emergency Relief Agency, and the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority, along with a dozen others. Most of the jobs were in construction to show fast results in buildings and roads.
Suddenly there's a job. Someone said, I got a job at last after 8 years of being on relief. I got a job on the WPA. And they were low times, but something great was happening. We count. We count.
The idea behind all of Roosevelt's New Deal is that people have talent. That you may be poor, you may be broke, you may be really down on your luck, but there's some talent in you. We need you, and we will pay you and we will help you if you kind of pitch in. And it was an inclusiveness to Roosevelt's policies that really psychologically started stirring people, at least to start moving out of the mire of the Great Depression.
I don't know where my next dollar's coming from. I'm isolated here in the mountains, with the snow deep and the wind hard and the appetite keen.
Vardis Fisher had written several novels, all ignored. A loner and free thinker, he rebelled against his Mormon upbringing. Fisher wrote hard, angular prose and burned to tell epic stories. But when he lost his university job, he retreated with his family to the Idaho Rockies of his childhood. From the start, the WPA faced bipartisan resistance from those who thought Roosevelt's New Deal was a colossal waste of money. WPA arts programs, including the Federal Writers Project, were highly suspect. Some writers had socialist and communist leanings, ideas viewed as threats to democracy. With fascism and communism sweeping across a troubled Europe, Americans watched and worried that instability at home might leave the nation vulnerable to the ideas of political revolution. This fear was fueled by Texas Congressman Martin Dies.
The fear of communism, the anti-communist hysteria, is increasing. And along with that, anybody who had any left leanings.
Dies' House Un-American Activities Committee pored over leaflets and petitions, called hundreds of witnesses, and held highly publicized hearings to weed out insurgents. The WPA, especially the Writers Project, was targeted as a breeding ground for communist subversives.
This is one of the most critical periods in the world's history. These groups are laying their groundwork now so that they will be in a position to strike, and strike hard.
Richard Wright, one of the best known of the project's writers, was an admitted communist. For Wright, communism seemed to offer the only answer to a system that conspired to keep him down. Dies resented any imposition of politics on the American public through government-sponsored agencies. His committee's hearings challenged the legitimacy of the work of the Writers Project and gained significant popular support.
This investigation must go on without fear or favor, and our slogan must be, no quarter to the enemies of our country.
Oh, they had a lot of opposition, but they had a lot of support too. At one time, some 6,000 telegrams were sent in support of the committee.
I have been following with interest and approval your activity against subversive influences. Keep up the good work. There are millions of us applauding. Sincerely, Judge Charles Dibble, Galveston.
In the glare of the committee's spotlight, Henry Alsberg, the former journalist and humanitarian leading the Writers' Project, was feeling the heat.
I want you to look at that and tell me that if you believe, get somebody to take those.
Often disorganized but determined to press on, Alsberg urged his writers to continue their work despite congressional scrutiny.
The purpose of the American Guide is to put it into the hands of people who don't realize wonders exist at their own door.
The wonders, however, were in the eye of the beholder, and that's where a split began between state editors and the project headquarters in Washington, D.C.
They could control the form of the guides, but the content came from the areas. And you can't do anything about that. Automatically, that creates a revolutionary situation.
As state director of the Idaho Guide, Vardis Fisher longed to gain national attention for his writing. He set about infusing the Idaho Guidebook with his own strong opinions. Fisher was also critical of the way Alsberg ran the Writers' Project. To fight back, he schemed with a local publisher to bring the Idaho Guide out first and show up the bureaucrats back east.
The thought is if you were the first guidebook, you'd get the most attention. It was going to get the newspaper headlines.
Henry Alsberg reserved that spotlight for himself and the Washington, D.C. Guidebook. He tried to rein in Fisher's efforts. Fisher, in turn, bucked Alsberg every chance he got.
By telephone and letter, Alsberg told me repeatedly that for Idaho to be first among the 48 states would be a dreadful embarrassment. I thought the national office so incompetent and cynical and political that I cared nothing about its embarrassment.
Fisher had other boulders in his path. Finding few writers to recruit fueled his belief that if you want something done, do it yourself. Ever the loner, he was skeptical of most advice he got from locals as he traveled every route in the state himself.
I took my job seriously. I was determined. But going to opinionated old-timers for information on origins has proved only that old-timers don't know half as much as they think they do.
Unlike Fisher, Jim Thompson hit the road in Oklahoma enthusiastically, chatting up folks and soaking up their stories.
I think he loved folk songs, he loved folk expressions, he loved local history in every possible way. And this absolute fascination with catching something just before it disappears and becomes something else.
Crisscrossing the state, Thompson drilled deep into the stories of a still rough Oklahoma. On a road near Manford, he found a farm where the Dalton gang had buried loot from their bank robberies. Some said it was still there. In Seminole, he found stories of dope peddling, bootlegging, and murder.
There is a very real basis for the stories of the Oklahoma outlaws. No one can deny that the Daltons and Doolans were all handy with rifle or six-shooter. But the story of the outlaw who lined his family up against a barn door and traced their silhouettes with six guns can be characterized only as a tall tale.
Thompson's constant companion was the unseen reader he hoped to reach. To him, the Oklahoma Guidebook should be used for more than just sightseeing.
The writer in a work of this kind has 1,000 chances to madden the reader and make himself ridiculous. Tourists can never be lost because we orient him constantly, and the orientation is not dependent on red barns, haystacks, and hoops and hollers.
In Washington, Alsberg struggled with incompetent state directors and political flack from Congress. Wrangling nearly 7,000 employees across 48 states and shaping 5 million words into a series of books would challenge any editor. In his wildest dreams, Henry Alsberg could not have imagined his ragtag army of writers or the American realities they uncovered. The South Dakota office consisted of hard-working ex-newspapermen, country editors, printers from defunct publications, a doctor, a lawyer, a sheep herder who had published a book, and almost anyone who could operate a typewriter. In the Southwest, WPA writers poking around for stories became known as El Diablo a Pie, the devil on foot.
I'm the person that's suspicious of government myself. I would be suspicious if somebody came to my door and asked me to tell stories. But even if I did it, I'd be, as one of the WPA writers, I'd be suspicious giving it to the next layer in the same fashion.
From the West Coast to the East, WPA writers in every state gathered the voices of America's people in life history interviews. From all walks of life and work, they offered glimpses of worlds that few people had ever seen.
I've walked this corner summer and winter, sick and well, blind, drunk, and stone sober. When you live like I done, people give you a line all the time, all day long. So you gotta be careful what you say to yourself, even more than what you say to cops and doctors.
The idea of a rodeo clown isn't only to make folks laugh, but to get the attention of the steer after the rider has been thrown. The first steer I ever rode was in Texas. I was a yard clerk for the railroad. I was sitting watching the steer riding when the others egged me on. A steer knows how to use his horns. It's the God's truth. A steer can scrape the ground so close, he can scratch up a cigarette paper.
I'm among the world of missing men. I'm so insignificant that they sent out a radio call for me 100 years. Nobody can find me. Economically, I'm collapsed. I could write my whole will on a postage stamp. I ain't got enough real estate to put in a flower pot. Tell me then, why should I sing My Country 'Tis of Thee?
You give them plenty of time, said one writer. They may talk for hours. Listen as if you may never see them again, he said. As if tomorrow they may die. That's the way you listen.
It's getting them out on the street. Writing is being a reporter. It's being a reporter with a really good sense of an imagination and thinking. But they were walking the streets, going into cafes, meeting people, talking to people. That's the material for a novelist.
More WPA guides came out in a sprint to the finish, published and sold by commercial presses. If not the first, Washington, city and capital, was one of the largest, at 5.5 pounds. Roosevelt joked that the massive volume should come with its own steamer trunk. But the Washington Guide received rave reviews. The California Guide became a Book of the Month Club selection, and other state guides were also lauded.
And some of them were so quirky that to this day people will pick up those books and say, "Oh my God."
Controversy again raised its head. Word spread that the guides might hold subversive materials, and opponents sprang up across the country. In Wisconsin, officials blocked the final funding for the Milwaukee Guide, claiming the writing was juvenile, inaccurate, and loaded with socialist propaganda. And when the Board of Supervisors in DuPage County, Illinois, read their history in the county guidebook, they scuttled the whole publication. Dyes had unleashed a nationwide hunt. To Allsburg and his staff, their only crime was giving a direct voice to people who otherwise remained silent.
The irony is that the Federal Writers Project gets attacked as being un-American, when in truth it was an orgy of Americanism.
Allsburg would fight not with fire, but with the air of an exasperated teacher. Allsburg was convinced the guides would speak for themselves.
What Martin Dies is seeing is these people aren't creative writers. What they're doing is trying to destroy my way of life. He has a view of what America is. It's the flag, it's the military, it's a sense of honor, duty, and country. What he doesn't have is the second half of that equation, which is it's a sense of loving the cultural richness of America.
Allsburg badly underestimated his opponent. In the end, his testimony struck his colleagues as a sad capitulation, lacking the defiance his own staff had shown when they had dared call the committee un-American. Dies won the day. The federal arts projects fell to the axe in May 1939. By then, over half of the state guides had come out. Facing pressure to resign, Allsburg vowed to stay on board until all the guides were published. He lost that battle too. After leaving the national stage, Allsburg lived quietly as an editor at a small publishing house. The Writers' Project carried on without him. The state offices were left to limp along if they could find funding on their own. For the next 2 years, the remaining guides trickled out. The life histories that Benjamin Botkin intended for a series of anthologies never appeared in print as envisioned. Most of the manuscripts piled up in a government warehouse and gathered dust for decades. The last guide for Oklahoma crept across the finish line in late 1941, just before the attack on Pearl Harbor took the country into World War II.
Roosevelt cleverly gets a second wind. And when World War II starts, he sees the WPA Guides as a way to celebrate Americanism, to kind of really put forward our country and what we are and what a democracy is.
The best-known literary critic of the day, Alfred Kazin, wrote the guide changed the course of American literature forever. In the grip of the Great Depression, WPA writers searched for America and discovered the soul of a people.
Funding for this program has been provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities, because democracy demands wisdom.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful beginning to the mood, I think, of both the film and the book, and also what is being achieved, I think, through this new look at the New Deal. I'd like to ask our panelists to step up and take their places for a few minutes, and we'll hear from them briefly before we proceed, and we'll have questions from the audience. Andrea, do you want to lead the way, and Peggy? And two Davids. Well, Andrea, I know that you started us off, but just seeing this and seeing the excerpts that we've shown, is there something else you'd like to add or say? Do you want to say a word about what wasn't seen?
How much time do we have? There's so much more to add and to say about the film. What you saw just now were highlights, as I mentioned, that we edited together. It will be a 2-hour film that will run hopefully consecutively as individual hours. And it was an incredibly inspiring experience, both to dig up the stories of these life histories, to get to know the writers and what informed their writing, the process of their writing, the process of creativity. And it was also a really great experience to invite writers today to read for the writers of the past. And so the voices that you heard, whether it was Richard Ford reading for Jim Thompson, Elmer Kelton for Vardis Fisher, we have Amy Bloom for Anzia. You didn't get to know the other characters. We just kind of gave you a glimpse of some of them. But working with those current day writers was also a really wonderful experience too. So.
Peggy Bolger represented the Library of Congress in many ways in this project for the number of years that we've been working on it. And Peggy, I'd like you to say what you'd like to say about the film and maybe the experience that you've had in this project.
Sure. It's great to see the film taking shape, and many of you in this room have really had a hand in helping with it. I know the Folklife Center has a huge amount of material that was used in the film, I think, and researchers coming to use our reading room, but also the manuscript division. Alice Burney has materials, P&P, obviously has a wealth of material. So, and Center for the Book, John's interest and his personal collection up here. Of
no one escaped us. Right.
Of the guides from my collection we can look at afterwards.
There's just a huge amount of wonderful original resource materials. And I think the thing that a lot of people need to remember is that this was a project that was to put people to work. It was not a project that I think a lot of people thought anything would come out of it worth anything. And not only was the results were incredible as far as putting talented people to work in a meaningful way, but also the results are being used today over and over. And one of the most satisfying things is that myself as a folklorist, I know that the whole field of public folklore really owes a huge debt to the Federal Writers Project and to the other arts projects, because this was the first time during the Federal Writers Project where people were told to go out and talk to ordinary people, that their stories were important. This was the story of America, and basically that's what our whole field is about. And so the American Folklife Center, we have this amazing inspiration that we use in order to continue. And these materials have been an inspiration for many of the oral history projects today. The Veterans History Project, in many ways, is founded on the principles that were used. StoryCorps, which is on NPR every Friday morning, that Dave Isay, who created that, admits that it was the Federal Writers Project and the materials in the Folklife Center that inspired that whole idea of getting a 21st century, if you will, slice of American life. And so I think that's, basically one of the things that we need to celebrate is that, and really look back on how this project is so important to the researchers today, and of course, Andre and Spark Media bringing this to life for the television will be really important.
Well, David Taylor, before you talk about your book in a few minutes, you also are the co-producer of the film. Would you like to talk a little bit about the film and how it might lead into the book? The leading question.
Sure. But first, I would like to say how thrilled I am to have this event here at the library. As you and others have said, just the stewardship that the Library of Congress has shown in managing everything from the folk life. And I think for a lot of people, the idea of the word folklore doesn't encompass really the music and people's stories that came out of this great project to work on, because it was really brought American government and arts and really egalitarian view of culture much, it widened it a lot from what it was before. And so it was exciting to work on, and to work on here in the library, to go to the manuscripts division downstairs that has over 400,000 WPA-related items in the collections, the Folklife Center, and John, your own work with your personal collection, but I understand that you have... actually, your research and work with the holdings goes back to the 70s and actually uncovering some parts of it that were lost in a warehouse near Baltimore. Is that right?
That's right. Well, thank you for not mentioning that the material was in a storehouse run by the Library of Congress in the film. We were just one of the warehouses, and I was a young collections librarian and actually was working with reading Jerry Mangione's wonderful history of the Federal Writers Project, and I came across a footnote that said that he was unable to find out about some of the materials that were in storage at the Library of Congress at a warehouse near Baltimore. And I recognized the response, and it came from my boss. I was working in collection development, and I went to him and said, "Is this true? And how about letting me work on inventorying that warehouse?" And I was one of several people interested in this, and that's how I got started with my interest. So thank you for letting me tell that story. I'll take 2 more pictures.
Well,
please go ahead.
And then thanks, of course, also to David and the Smithsonian Channel for its support in getting the film finished and out to a national audience, and to the National Endowment for the Humanities for the crucial funding that got this going over. So for 7 years, Andrea and I have been working on getting this story together for both the film and the film really shows through those interviews that you saw, you get a handful of the characters and their lives, and I feel the book kind of takes up from there and shows a number of the stories that we didn't get time to get into the film. So they go together very well, I think.
Well, the other David from the Smithsonian, David Royal, would you like to tell us a little bit about the Smithsonian's involvement in this and what your hopes are for spreading the word?
Yes. Well, you know, I'll just start by saying when I first came to America as a young student, it was to North Carolina, and that was the first time I encountered folklore and oral history. And I had a friend who would take me up to the mountains of Appalachia, around Asheville and Boone and places like that, and we would go to log rolling, or would get stories of log rolling and quilting bees, and it was really one of the things that stimulated my own personal interest in filmmaking and storytelling. And I think of it as a peculiarly American trait. And what's so wonderful about Andrea's project and about the original WPA Writers Project is that it is so democratic. It is about going across America and getting people's stories. And it's not the stories of the high and mighty. It's the stories of everyone and anyone. And you know, one of the stories that particularly moved me was in that clip today was the man in New York who said, "I'm among the world of missing men. I'm so insignificant that if they sent out a radio call for me, in 100 years, no one would find me." Well, now they will, because he's in Andrea's film. And what's so wonderful about this is that there's a film and there's a book. And it all came out of David's magazine article in Smithsonian magazine some years ago called "A Noble and Absurd Undertaking." These are huge projects. As David said, it took 7 years. Is that longer than the New Deal? I think it probably is. And it is a huge undertaking, and it is born out of the passion and determination of these 2 filmmakers. My hat's off to them. It takes a real foolhardiness to set off on a journey like this, and it's a great triumph to reach this stage with it. We're very, very proud to have it on the Smithsonian Channel. We see ourselves as America's storytellers. That's how we're pitching ourselves. That's what we're trying to do. And this is a wonderful and important story. Of course, the timing is both sad in some respects, but also has made this film particularly important. And I think it is really resonating with people who see it and the public. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for our panelists from the audience, please? Yes, sir.
I'd like to know a couple of things just quickly. What was the writer's pool like? Which writers were actually drawn, and how were the selections made? And Secondly, how controversial, at least in the planning and at the outset of the project, either in terms of the cost of it, after all, this was the Depression, or if not that, perhaps even the ideology of it, political or otherwise.
First part of the question dealt with the selection of the writers. Who would like to take that?
I can start, and I'm sure others can fill in. But yes, there was the question of what the pool of writers was to draw on. You see that more in the film and the book, but it was intended to be a nationwide project, and so really there was the question of how would you have enough writers to write guidebooks to all the states. The formula that they worked out on was that 9/10 of the project had to be on relief, meaning you had to prove that you basically had no income, had nothing, had no rent to pay, that you had, you had no ability to pay rent.
No hope.
No hope. What they call the pauper's oath.
The pauper's oath,
yeah.
right.
So 9 out of 10 of the people on the project had to have that level of instability. So, but the 1/10 they could recruit from working writers. So the director, Henry Alsberg, sent out contacts among his former journalist network, among universities. For example, Vardis Fisher got word from his former boss at the University of Montana. So you had 1/10 of the pool from professional writers, but they definitely widened the definition of what professional writer meant in order to just fill slots and make it a relief project.
Anyone like to add to that?
I think also it's important to point out that only 1% of the WPA budget went to the Writers Project. So the controversy was not in so much money being spent, but it was the kind of story that they were telling. You know, it was a question of whether the country was ready to hear that story and wanted to hear that story, and then used some of the information that they dug up against the project, and said it was propaganda, sabotage, and all of the above. So, after only 4 short years, it was eventually, brought down.
And just about the controversy, I did many years of work with Stetson Kennedy of Florida, who was one of the writers, and he tells the story over and over again about the writing of the Florida Guide and about how they really wanted to make the Florida Guide more than moonlight and magnolias, he said. He wanted them to know about pellagra and the fact that, people were hungry in some parts of Florida, and it wasn't just a paradise for people to come for tourism, but he said invariably they would send their manuscripts to first the state office in Jacksonville, and they'd have the first editing of it. But when it went to the federal office, it was pretty much rewritten. Anything that wasn't that was considered controversial get cut out of it, so that it ended up being, to him, not very satisfactory in many ways. So he decided to write the book that he really wanted to write later, which was called Palmetto Country, which, he included all the stuff that got cut out of the state guide.
Peggy, do you want to say something about Ben Botkin and how he got involved in the project? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe someone else does.
Actually, Steve, do you know how Ben Botkin was here in Florida? I mean, in D.C., and he was asked to be the head of the folklore unit.
He'd come from Nebraska, from
Oklahoma, yeah.
Right, from the university.
Yeah, he. Oh, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I'll just say what I know was that I know that Botkin gave a talk at the League of American Writers conference, and that soon after about the breadth of his vision of folklore and collection, and it was soon after that that Henry Alsberg asked him to be the folklore director after John Lomax was leaving.
And there were, I should say that in the field of folklore, many of our great, role models worked on Federal Writers Project, Zora Neale Hurston, certainly Ben Botkin, and many, many others who were involved in it. So it's an interesting thing. When I first went to Florida as the state folklorist in 1975, I was very young, and I was trying to find out what had been done in Florida before as far as life histories and folklore, and I was reading all the WPA material and was just bowled over by it. I kept running into this name, Stetson Kennedy, and I just assumed he was dead because, you know, this was like a long time ago. Well, he was probably my age at the time, come to think of it. But it ended up being, you know, talking to Stetson, many of the writers were very young. I mean, he was 21 when he was on that project. So you have John Cheever, you have all these guys that we know from much later in life, but they really cut their eye teeth on the Federal Writers Project, which was a great way to get your training, I think.
Other questions from the audience, please? Over here. And David Taylor, a different David Taylor, who works in the American Folklife Center, is taken on the microphone.
David A. Taylor.
David, another David A. Taylor.
Are you an Alan?
No, I think
okay. Well,
I have too many David A. Taylor titles.
Say a little bit about to what extent there are drafts of material that you see as you compare it with what was published, and then you just mentioned the rewrites in Washington. Is that material all available? Mm-hmm. And second, not to make it too big a question, but I'm wondering about what the publishing plans are for other parts of the materials that are in your holdings.
I can just say a little bit about the material. The manuscripts division downstairs here has drafts for from all of the states for both portions that ended up in the guide, the WPA guides, but also things that didn't end up there. So you have drafts about the New Orleans guides that have fascinating information on the social history within New Orleans that got in a different version in the guide. There were drafts in collections in Chicago that had Richard Wright's draft essays for the WPA Guide to Illinois that didn't make it in. Those essays have been published somewhere, I think. And portions are in the book, but.
And recently, Zora Neale Hurston, there was a draft of a piece that she wrote about the American Negro, and that never got published during that time. And I believe we have copies in the manuscript division too, and I believe there's talk of getting that published.
I'll just add one word to this, and that is that there are continual rediscoveries. Part of it was because the material has come back to the Library of Congress from different resources. But if you pick up a copy of the Folklife newsletter that I mentioned before, it talks about the New Deal web guide and other online resources that are being developed here at the library. And part of that story is online, but part of it consists of some of the new discoveries that, and Alice Burney is here, and I remember, I believe it was in the copyright records, you've helped discover the new play by Zora Neale Hurston, which in fact was performed at the Library of Congress. Is that correct? Correct enough? Let David.
There were in fact 10 plays, but that was in the copyright deposits, 6 short ones and 4 long ones. And they did have a good airing here in the library. That was my own personal project that I pushed forward. But just in response to the previous question, researchers are constantly going into the WPA and Federal Writers materials and finding publishable material in there. A woman named Pam Bordelin, who Peggy may know, a few years ago, mined out some material, folkloristic material from the Writers Project and published it in a book, and it also was Zora Neale Hurston material, at least in part. So this goes on, and anybody can do it, even if the library itself doesn't have a particular project to publish one overwhelming document. There's so much there that there's plenty for everybody.
I should just say in David's book, there's a section called Resources for Readers and Travelers, plus a listing of a number of the books that have been inspired by the Writers Project. We have time for a couple more questions from the audience. Yes, ma'am, over here. Let's wait for we'll take both of these over here, David.
Hi, I'm Michelle Boston from the Big Read DC. Hi, David. I'm just glad to see the film. I had expected coming here to see a talk and author discussion, but the film relates to my question, and that is, what are the outreach tools or plans for getting the information about the WPA out to the public? Because people have been sort of volleying WPA around in different forums, and you have an audience now who hasn't interacted with people from the Great Depression, have no idea what WPA is, didn't see Cradle Will Rock the movie or the play. And I'd just like to know your plans for getting it out to the general public. And also, even for the Library of Congress, how can the doors be opened so that people can know and access and learn from the triumphs and some of the mistakes of the WPA?
Thanks, John. Yes, actually, and there will be a little bit of talk about the book itself at 4, but in terms of the question of... Yes.
All right.
And the outreach, the NEH has funded, and Andrea will talk more about this, for 30 libraries across the country to explore the Writers Project legacy, and including seeing the film and evenings, panel discussions, and exploring the writers' later work.
Yeah, and the American Library Association is creating a website with resources that can be downloadable for all libraries, not just those that were selected in this first group of 30. They're planning to roll out programs through 2009 and then into 2010. With that, you'll have all kinds of study guides and viewing materials, enhancement materials on particular themes that the film may touch on, but you'll have multimedia pieces that support those in greater detail.
I might add that this film really is resonating with people, and Andrea and David are achieving a fantastic audience through the ALA. I believe there was an event last week in New York that had 700 to 800 people turn up for it. So people are very, very curious about this, want to know more.
And as for the Library of Congress, one of the great things that came out of the symposium that we had 2 years ago, where we were celebrating the New Deal at 75, was that we had many of the divisions here in the library work together on a web portal, and that is now up online. And I think that if you pick up a copy of the newsletter in the back, it's got the URL, but we realized that researchers coming to the library, could run yourself ragged going from one building to another and discovering where things were. So we wanted to have really one-stop shopping on the web, where you could at least find, even if the materials weren't digitized, you know where they are. They're in the manuscript division, P&P, or whatever, so that a researcher could really make the most use of their time here by calling ahead and having all those materials brought up in one place.
So be sure and pick this up. We have time for one more question for this portion of the program, please.
Well, considering that Martin Dies was such a ubiquitous figure in this, I'm curious to know who selected the editors of the state guides and who guided who made the choice? In other words, were they political appointees? Were they literary types? Were they sensitive to the fact that they might be attacked and that sort of question? Is anybody able to speak to that in general? Because I think the editing that's the critical juncture at which the stuff gets filtered in and then out to the public. And who decides what gets out?
Well, there was I don't think initially when it started in 1935, when they were just setting up state offices, I don't think they realized the potential for it to be so controversial. Some of the state editors were chosen, for example, through humanitarian networks. Lyle Saxon in New Orleans had worked with Harry Hopkins and the Red Cross after World War I. So there was a personal and perhaps a political connection there. There were other cases where the editor was chosen because they knew the senator or very local politics. I don't think it became a national political issue until a couple of years in, when they started to find, like Andrea said, that the material, they were trying to be very true to the local histories that they found in most cases, and that was a time when, because of the Depression, even something that we regard now as innocuous as labor history, perhaps it was like a tinderbox. It would just set off all sorts of red flags. And so there was a wide range of how political the position was. I mean, you have in Nebraska, the state editor was a former hobo who was just, he was a University of Nebraska student until he dropped out and went across the country on the rails, and his former professor pointed him towards the office, and he got the job he worked up from a low-level editing position. So that was not a political position at all in that sense. So some people worked their way up, and some people were politically installed.
Well, as I said, one final question, short question about this segment, and then we're going to open it up after David speaks. Stephen, do you want to? Okay. Over here. Question was to the panel if they have any collective advice regarding storytelling and people who want to pursue this kind of work today.
And I'd like to just say that there are a few proposals that have been suggested to either Congress or the administration. President Obama has just recently appointed a person who's in charge of culture for the Domestic Policy Council. These are the kinds of things that we're hoping there'll be some wonderful things coming out of it. Certainly the stimulus package did give some money to NEH, a little bit of money, some money to NEA, not enough. And I would just say, write to your congressman and say, gee, wouldn't it be a great idea? But I think that there are many people who have made that point, that we're now at a point where perhaps it's time to do a project similar where out-of-work writers and artists could also be put to work.
Thank you, Peggy. Steve, did you want to have the...
I just wanted to make a comment more than a question, that one of the great things about the WPA and some of the collections that we have at the library is that the whole New Deal was very early in the history of recorded audio. And so not only do we have the great writers who sort of put together the works that they did, but we actually have the words, the speech, and the singing of a lot of the individuals. We have their voices recorded. And you can hear a lot of those on the American Folklife Center website and other parts of the Library of Congress website. You can find speech and singing and music from the people that were being interviewed. And we have a lot of the Florida material is up that Peggy was talking about. And Pearl Nye, who was in the film, we have his entire sung repertoire on the web at our website. So definitely, you know, the Library of Congress is making great efforts to get this material out, and we have gotten a lot of it out there, and now the challenge is to let people know that it's out there and get people to come and visit. So please do come visit our web.
So again, those a number of those citations are here. And
no, I'm sorry, John. I just wanted to add that
right.
We actually do feature in the full-length documentary some of these recordings that Steve is talking about, and it's really exciting to hear the texture of the voices, even the fidelity of the sound. harkens back to another era. So when you see the full film, you'll get to dive into all the richness of the materials and a lot of the source, what I call source cues, or the different musics, the songs that you heard. So many of them have come from the library's collection, and we've made a special effort to dig in and dig up a lot of this music that is not heard mainstream. And so that's part of what we also wanted to enrich the experience, is to draw on the music, the artwork, as we said, the photographs, and of course the words of the writers.
Thank you. I'm going to ask, David is going to speak briefly about the book for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to open this up again to continue our discussion. But you want to hear from him, and I also, again, there's so many websites listed in the back of this book that I think our event is really part of the process of opening all of this up. David, would you mind coming over here for about 10 minutes, and then we will open it up again? Would the panel like to stay where you are, or why not? You want to sit in the, okay, sit in the front row. Okay. And David is not only a writer of books and film, but his work, as has been mentioned earlier, was published in Smithsonian Magazine, which was one of the reasons that this film really came about, and in the American Scholar, where I have read his articles. His collection, Success Stories, received the 2008 Fiction Award from Washington Writers Publishing House, is the author of the award-winning book Ginseng, The Divine Root, and has written documentaries for PBS, National Geographic, and the Discovery Channel. As I said before, he's not only the author of the book, but co-producer of the film. Let's one more time welcome David Taylor. David?
Thanks, John. And since you've got a sense of the story, so I will keep this fairly brief. But I did want to give some sense of the vignettes. This is such a rich story that this can only be sort of an introduction to it that you could see in the film and the book. But there are a couple of stories about the writers themselves that kind of give you a sense of how revolutionary this was at the time. I mean, this was it was an opportunity when American government and the arts and culture did come together. And what they produced in the WPA Guides and the life histories of everyday people from all walks of life, and those are thousands of them on the Library of Congress website that you can look, you can search them by a location, you can search by the name of your town, you can search and find them. They don't have all states covered in but on the map of the life histories, but you can see they do have thousands of them, and the people even who were interviewed in one place talk about their travels other places. So this is, in some sense, the research for this book and for the film uncovers things that weren't available, connections that you couldn't make before in terms of what the writers did in this time of crisis 75 years ago. What they produced surprised Americans at the time. The reviews for the guides were fascinating, I think partly because these writers and these researchers were working so far outside of the conventional establishment for codifying American history and literature. You have reviews that were, that talk about this, the picture of America that you get from these guides is unlike any that you've seen in the history books before. And this is because these writers come from way outside of the literary establishment. Two examples were young men who grew up in the same town. Ralph Ellison grew up in the Black District of Oklahoma City under segregation. His father died in a work accident when Ralph was 3. His mother worked as a single parent, worked hard. He got a partial scholarship to study music. He was on the path to becoming a composer and a conductor. And then the Depression hits, and his mother dies, and he can't make even the minimum tuition payments. So he ends up in New York. And without a vocation. He's incredibly talented and adaptable, and he gets a spot on the Writers' Project courtesy of Richard Wright. And so soon he's interviewing people in Harlem, on street corners. He's seeing new patterns in their stories, in American history, and what it means. This is a dramatically new context for history that people didn't have before. He sees his own and Richard Wright's place in the historic migration of African Americans north, something that he hadn't read about in the books at Tuskegee. And they begin showing this epic in both the writing that they do for the WPA Guides, but also in the fiction that they're writing on their own and that they're talking about on their own. And so the project is getting people together who had been isolated and who had lost opportunities. And meanwhile, at the same time, you have Jim Thompson, also raised in Oklahoma City. His father was a deputy sheriff. He grew up he'd like to say he grew up over the jail, over the county jail. His father took risks in the oil business, lost his shirt, and basically Jim is supporting the family while he's still in high school. He's working in his sleazy hotels and basically makes money by basically pimping and drug dealing, just doing anything to get by. He does get to college for some credits. He studies writing in Nebraska, and that's where he meets Ben Botkin, who we've mentioned as the folklore director. He ends up back in Oklahoma City. He is barely getting by. He has a wife and a small child at that point, and along comes the Oklahoma Writers Project, and so he gets a position there, and soon he's basically hired as a writer for the routes, for writing up the driving routes, the driving tours in the WPA Guide to Oklahoma. So he's documenting those things, as you saw in the clip. He's taking it seriously. He's getting people's stories down. He also ends up, he rises through the ranks. He he writes the essay on folklore for Oklahoma, which includes some incredibly dark stories about, both the sort of the known criminals, but also just sort of the folklore about casual crimes and hangings and things that when he becomes a noir novelist in the 1950s, maybe some people didn't bat an eye, but I don't think anybody else who read his novels in the 50s would make any link to Oklahoma old stories there. So many parts of this story unfolded in the decades after the project through these writers and through what they found in uncovering real stories in America. So there are a lot more stories. This is just a start of that. The other thing I want to say in terms of what it means for people now has to do, some time ago I was a guest instructor at a writing workshop nearby here with the Earth Conservation Corps in Anacostia. And we had 6 students, actually, former students. None had finished their high school. The program gave them sort of license to be junior reporters about DC and also to write about their own experiences. And so in some ways it was like a very, very small writer's project. It was 6 people. And they approached the work, the idea of a writing workshop kind of uncertainly. None of them had really read much before, much less written about their own stories. And they had all survived homelessness, abuse, depression, enough to close off the avenues of their own stories. But once they got started writing, it was amazing to see how that they were excited and energized by what came out. And so while it takes us back to the idea during hard times of writing, sending out a crew to record America's stories seems very counterintuitive as a response to a recession or depression or any crisis. But it's really only in taking stock of our stories that we really unlock strengths that we don't know we have as individuals and as a people. And I think that's what really, I hope that the stories of the people in the book and the film bring out, and that's what all the legacy, you can go beyond that into what's in the Library of Congress you really find. So that's all I have to say. Thank you all for coming, and I'm be glad to take any questions at this point. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, there's one.
Okay. First thing is a bit more of a comment than a question. I am a professional writer, and it appears to me fantastic in a way that the kinds of people you have described could have put out the kind of work that they put out, considering that they had no professional background at all. A lot of them came from very hardscrabble circumstances, were very young and inexperienced at anything except staying alive, apparently. I'd like to know what you make out of that and how they managed to do this. The second question is what became of most of these people? Did they? I'm talking about the writers now, particularly. Did they? Did a lot of them? Obviously, the ones whose names we all know went on to become writers, but the others just sort of drifted off and did whatever they did. Or
well, they're interesting. I'll take the first question first in terms of how these inexperienced writers came up with publishable guides, and admittedly that the quality of the guides varies quite a bit. I mean, there's an introduction to some of the gems of them. There's a couple of anthologies that really point you to some of the better guides, but it's remarkable how much of the work is really fine. I think they were both inspired by the stories that they found. The core of editors, both in the states where they had professional writers working, even the former hobo Rudolph Umland in Nebraska, had learned about a system for developing editing desks and a process for editing that was valuable for making the Nebraska Guide excellent. You also had a dedicated, Henry Ellsberg, the national director, was dedicated to the work, and he recruited young, dedicated editors too, including Jerry Mangione, who John Cole mentioned, who later wrote a history about the project. So I think editing is key in any publishing enterprise, and that was one where, as chaotic as it was much of the time, they had a process for getting the books together and in good shape.
did the editors do fact-checking, or was there any fact-checking?
There actually was, and then there were different levels of fact-checking. And in Nebraska, Rudolph Umland later wrote about how they went back to landmarks and corrected figures that that had gotten wrong. They corrected a museum in Omaha claimed to have a coin that said 4 BC. They kind of pointed out the obvious impossibility of that. So there were different fact-checking rigors involved. In terms of what happened to a lot of the unknown writers later, one of my favorite stories is, well, there were several writers all over the country who did end up writing books that might not have been known nationally, but they were inspired to get those stories down. And again, in Nebraska, in North Platte, a woman named Ruby Wilson was a professional nurse. She had supported her family for years when her husband could no longer work. But then she got a job on the Writers Project. She interviewed a huge cross-section of North Platte while she was on the project, basically 1% of the town, over 100 interviews from all walks of life, from Mexican farm workers to the Japanese diner owners. And she later wrote a history inspired by her time. Then she became an author of a history of a pioneer in that area who otherwise would have been lost to history. There was another secretary on the Idaho project, later wrote a history of her hometown. So there were a lot of histories that got written afterwards by people who were on the project who either didn't claim it at the time. Like for decades afterwards, it was still kind of a blight on your reputation to have worked on the Writers Project, either because Martin Dies had been very effective as branding it as communist, and it had been seen as a government, a dole, a welfare project where people hadn't been working. So there were a couple reasons why you wouldn't talk about it much. But a lot of the people did, who didn't think of themselves as writers before, did continue in some ways telling stories or editing. Thanks.
So about 2 years ago, I got a question to ask a librarian question here at the library, and it was a retired couple who was going to ride a tandem bike across country, and they were very limited in the amount of stuff they could carry, obviously, but they really wanted a copy of each state's writer's guide with them, and they were asking whether the Library of Congress or anybody else had digitized all of the guides. And at the time, this is a couple years ago, I looked around everywhere and I couldn't find a full collection. What I found is some of the states had individually, state libraries had digitized the guides. So I thought it was a really great project, an idea for a project, and I put it through in my division, and I don't know if it went anywhere. And of course there have been all these web portals and things since. Does anyone know if the guides have been, and Google Books hadn't done them at the time, does anyone know if the guides have been digitized, and if not?
Actually, about, not all of them, but the Berkeley Library has digitized a lot of them. So if you search there's a site on their blog where they mention how you can search their, there are at least 50 of the books, including almanacs, city almanacs, and state guides and city guides in PDF format. So you can, they're big PDFs or in other digital formats, but you can download them and you can search by names. You can they are digitally available that way.
I was just surprised not to find a collection of all of the state guides together in one source. Like
is one reason why it probably hasn't been.
Hello, and thank you for your incredible work. To your knowledge, did some of the documentation of the darker sides of American life and some of the structural inequalities lead to any social movements or make some of the writers into activists, anything like that?
That's a very good question in terms of the darker sides of American stories that the writers found. How did that lead to some of the later movements? Yes, and some of those writers talked directly to that. Meridel Lesueur in Minnesota, at a reunion of the writers in the 80s, she talked about how, Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison were definitely energized by and made activist by their work with the project. Margaret Walker in Chicago, both in terms of the civil rights movement, in terms of the women's movement. She became really a mentor in both, and she mentored a lot of African-American authors. She basically mentored Alice Walker, who later recovered Zora Neale Hurston's legacy. And so there's definitely a lineage there in awareness and in movements. In both of those, Native American movement, the film you see has a branch of the Iroquois in Wisconsin, the Oneida, whose language was on the verge of dying out, and a small pocket of the Writers' Project was devoted to not only transcribing the Oneida language for the first time, but also getting elders' stories in the language and documenting it. And the Oneida elders now point to that effort as both a vital part of their history, but also a vital part of energizing them and in their past and in creating, reviving their culture. Any other questions?
Just one more.
This
I'm
is your
sorry.
chance.
This
Right,
is,
I'm sorry.
This is quick. In the beginning of in the introduction of the book, you talk about how you had been loaned a copy of the New Orleans Guide by a friend and had actually used it. I was wondering if you've subsequently used any of the other guides for personal travel besides the New Orleans one, or if it all just suddenly morphed into the project.
Well, actually, yeah. Well, they kind of both. I mean, whenever we would travel in the research for the film or for the book research, I would take along one of the reprints of the guide. So in Illinois, I was walking around, and the Illinois guide is a great resource. It still has the L, and it has a lot of the factors. The New York guide is wonderful. Michael Chabon talks about using it in recreating New York of the 30s for the amazing adventures of Cavalier and Clay. I used the Florida guide's great. I mean, it's one of the few times when they mention one of the workers by name. They say, this is Zora Neale Hurston's view of her hometown, Eatonville. So, and then you get basically verbatim what she wrote about Eatonville. Some of the others, Wisconsin Guide is also excellent. California Guide is one of, I've used some. So yeah, I've used probably about 10 or 12. And it's been interesting to talk with people in researching this. David Bradley, who you saw interviewed, he would get the guide to his home state in Pennsylvania or Texas, where he taught for a while, or California, where he's lived. And he would dig into them in a way. The New York Times legendary journalist R.W. Apple Jr., or Johnny Apple, he discovered the guides when he was in the Army in Virginia, and he used them every time. He wrote many guidebooks later, and he was Apple's America is a great sort of look at America through his eyes, and he was inspired by how he had used the guides. So they're very useful still.
There was some mention of the Mangione book. I was just curious in what ways you saw your book going beyond what Mangione has done.
Yeah, I feel Jerry Mangione's book in the early 70s, he wrote The Dream and the Deal. And it is a wonderful resource from both the first-hand account, but also he gathers, he interviewed many people to put that together. And as comprehensive as it is, it's still, what has come out in the decades since then. Like, he didn't have anything about Jim Thompson, and yet, in the decades since then, Jim Thompson his reputation has revived and so interest in his experience in Oklahoma has become greater. Other stories like that too. My book is not intended as it's almost more like an entry point where you get about a handful of individuals' stories as a framework for learning about the project. The Dream and the Deal is much more intended as almost academic history capable of standing on its own about what happened. John mentioned being inspired to do his research by a footnote in The Dream and the Deal, and at the conference last year, a number of people said they had basically started on a whole research direction from a footnote in Jerry Mangione's book. So there's a lot there that this just unpacks part of. Thanks. And one last question, or?
I came in late, so forgive me if this has come up before. But has there ever been an anthology of the best stuff from the Life Stories project?
There were several anthologies, and Peggy would be able to talk about. There was one actually published at the time. That's right. So actually, there was one. Well, These Are Our Lives was published back in the 40s as the project was still wrapping up. Lay My Burden Down was another one edited by Ben Botkin from the slave narratives, and then, but for the thousands of those life histories ended up in storage for years, and then Anne Banks published an anthology of them in First Person America, which is available in paperback, and I think there may be one other one actually on that Jerry Hirsch edited, but yes, there are resources in the appendix in the book, sort of where you can look for more of both the life histories and the guides.
Well, thanks again for coming.
Well, you're all invited to stay for a reception where you can talk to our speakers. Also, if you would like to look at any of the guidebooks, I brought Idaho, Pennsylvania, California, Nebraska, those that I saw that David had really delved into, and I'll be happy to show those to you. Have your wine at that end, look at your books at this end. Let's conclude by one more round of applause for all of our speakers and our panelists. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.